first open up Qualtrics, if you haven't created any surveys before, you will get a blank screen asking you to create your first survey. It may look like this or may look something like this. So we're just going to go through the basics in getting started. So to start with, we're just going to create a survey by giving it a project name. I'm just going to call this test survey. You can create it from a copy if you've got existing surveys that you want to copy, or a library, which is a system where you can share surveys with a select group of people, or even if you've got a survey that you've previously done or someone else has done, they can download that survey and you can upload it. But for the moment, we're just going to go from a blank project and I'm going to call it test survey, and we'll start here. So this first video is going to be very short to talk about some of the basic features and overview of Qualtrics. So when you see your survey open up in a window like this, there's a few features that it's worth thinking about. This very top corner here, it takes you back to your main page. So it's worth just being aware of that. If you want to go back and set up a second or third survey, that's the button to click on. This will be the title of your survey. And you will notice that I have lots of other different surveys which you will as you build up surveys. One of the things to note in Qualtrics is that it really moves from left to right. So you're going to set up your survey. You might do some things which we'll talk about later in terms of actions. You'll distribute it in terms of collecting data. Then you'll get your data and you'll analyze it. And finally, you may or may not produce some reports. And within each of these, you can change the look and feel and the flow, which I will talk about, some of the options to the survey and some of the tools. So again, a left to right move. Just thinking about how the window is set up overall, you'll notice that there's this thin white box around the edge of this sort of grey-blue box. This is called a block, and these are really important to think about in terms of setting up the elements of your survey. So when I think about elements, you might want to consider things like your introduction, the information sheet, your consent form, some demographics, and maybe the key components of your survey. So you might have some attitudes, you might be looking at certain sorts of behaviours from people to report different bits on your survey. So each element of your survey is worth thinking about, should really be considered setting up in a separate block. This will make it much easier to randomize or to modify your survey later on and actually to navigate around it. So the first thing that you should always do is begin to think about what are the core elements of the survey that I want to collect, and try and break that. So this isn't at the level of questions, this is at the level of groups of questions about similar themes, and we'll call those the block. Now within the block you have the question. So this is the grey box that we have here. The default is just a multiple choice, and we'll talk about changing those as we go through. And if you look on the right hand side, we have a column which has got all of the different things you can do with this single question. So we can change the question type by clicking on the green box at the top here, and you'll notice that there are all different sorts of questions and styles of questions, and even within these there's a little drop down arrow with multiple variations. And what you'll notice is that Qualtrics gives you an example of what that might look like. So here we are looking at multiple choice, and we could have single answer, which has a circle around it, which means they can answer one of those questions. We could have multiple answers, which will generally be a square, which means they can tick on multiple options. You can have it with text, you could have it with graphics, you can have it horizontally, or you can have it vertically. So there's all these different variations, and you can change these even if you click on a question. You can change the type of that question even when you've entered some details or information. So here is your question across the middle there, and here are the things you can do with your question. So you can change the number of choices, which we'll go through when we talk about setting up questions in various different ways. And we can give different options as we go through. So some of these can be adjusted to fit the exact question that you will need for your survey. So we have a question. What we'll notice here, we have below the question, you have a plus, which means we can add a question below, or we can add a question above. What you'll see by me just putting these two new questions is the questions get numbered in the order in which you create them. So if I create another question below here, this was the first question that I created, that's going to become question 4 because I created this question, then this question, then this question, then this question. Now that might seem confusing at first, but it's okay because you can change the numbers of these questions to whatever you want. It's worth noting that the participants who are completing the survey won't see those questions. These will just be for your reference, and if you're going to download the data into Excel or into SPSS or any other formats, this will be the reference to the column. So sometimes we might want to give that something more meaningful. So I might call it info for my info sheet. I might call it consent for my consent form. I might call a question gender if I was asking around a gender question. So you can see that you can change these. Again, the participant does not see that. That is merely for your information. The participant will only see information to the right of this line. So the questions will be ordered in the order that you create them, wherever you create them, and we can always delete questions. So if we click on the red remove question, now these questions do get kept. So what we'll notice here is at the bottom we'll have these questions that in the trash that I have deleted. So if I delete a question by accident, it will exist here and I can restore it or permanently delete it. There is really no reason to permanently delete unless the trash becomes overwhelming or too big. For the most part, we just ignore that. But just be worth mentioning that if you deleted something by accident by clicking on this button, that you can easily go into your trash at the bottom and restore that question. So I can click on restore and that moves the question back to where it started. So the other thing is we can actually change the name of the block. So I will be setting up in the next few videos how to a survey. So the first block I will always have is my information block about the survey. So we might call it info sheet. This would have been in a traditional survey, a piece of paper or something we hand out in an online survey. This block is going to refer to that information sheet. So there's a block. What you'll notice as well, there is a down arrow, so we can minimize that. So we could have multiple questions within a single block. So if I just add some questions below here and then minimize that, they're all within there. This is just an easier way to navigate around the menus. So again, I'm just going to delete some of those because we don't need them at the moment. I could also then create a second block, which I might create for my consent form. And then I could create another block, which I would do for my demographics. We can move these around at any point later on. And as you notice, they don't have any questions in them at the moment, but we'll add some questions as we go through. So we have one question in here. We have no questions in here, no questions in here. But I might have some separate questions about particular things. So in this case, I might have some questions about attitudes towards a topic area, which I might be putting some questions in there. I might have some questions about certain sorts of behaviours, and then I might have a separate set of questions, which is asking some opinion on some information, which we'll go through as we set up our test survey. So you can see we can set up separate blocks and we can work on any blocks at any time by adding questions into those blocks. So as I said, it's worth thinking about what are the core elements of your survey and we'll consider those as blocks, and then what are the questions within those blocks. So we're moving from left to right. What we're going to be working through is our setting up our survey. Just to go through some other basics, you can adjust the look and feel. So we have a default under the UE brand. We could just turn it blank if we wanted to, and we can change any features of these to however we would like. If we want to include progress bars or texts, we can put them in there. If we had certain sorts of colors or fonts that we want to change, and how we want to set up our questions, these can all be adjusted within the look and feel option. So we can also add some other logos if we were working with other outside organisations or funding agencies. We could add a logo here. We could also add that within the information sheet at the beginning if we only wanted to show it on a single page. It's worth noting that if you look at the top here, this is what the question will look like on a computer screen. It also adjusts it for what it would look like on a mobile as well. So you can see how that will all look. And when we do a preview, that will also show these different styles. So you can get a sense of the style and look of the question form as we go through. So you can see there's just different sorts of styles, so it may be worth playing around, and you can just restore the defaults if you want to go back to the initial defaults. So we have a theme here. There are other presets that you could set up, but generally most people either have a blank or will just have the standard theme as we go through. So I'm just going to click on save there, and that saves the theme of the survey. Survey flow we'll talk about in a later video, but just to let you know and just to show you here, this is how participants will navigate through the survey. So they will start here and move through this. What we'll do is set up different ways that they can navigate. So you might have different information presented to different participants at different points of the survey. So we can see here we can add branches, things to randomize it. We can do all sorts of different elements. I will talk about a few of those in the later videos. The third option is the survey options. I'm not going to go through all of these, but what you'll notice are these are the things that are generally about this particular survey. So this is about this survey, not your surveys in general. So if you wanted to add a back button, you can put that in there, or you can remove it. The defaults generally are okay for most of the surveys that people complete. Most people do not include question numbers, because things might be randomized or they might be in an odd order, so they don't include those, and I'd suggest not to include question numbers. The one thing that you might want to change is the survey title. This is what gets displayed in the tab on the browser. So I am just going to put test survey, and what you'll see in the top of the tabbed browser is it will say now test survey. Other things that you can include here is if it was for a specific audience, you could password protect it and you could include a particular password there. There's some issues you can do in terms of if you want to use it for polling or voting, you can prevent ballot box stuffing, which doesn't allow people to take it more than once. And then there's some options in terms of end of survey messages and how we want to deal with partial completion. As I said, most of the defaults are generally fine. One sort of thing that people might want to do is redirect at the end to maybe a university site or a particular help site or a particular web page more about the study. So we can put in those, or we can put in a particular custom end of survey message that they get at the end of the survey. But it's worth just looking through those to see if you're happy with the options around that survey. Lastly, there are some tools that are worth being aware of. You can collaborate. There's a number of ways you can do this. So generally, you'll be working on a project with a principal investigator or a supervisor or a colleague, and it's worth just sharing that survey so you can both look at the same survey from your own accounts, and you can give them different sorts of permissions. So if you could collaborate, you can add people in here, and you can give people different forms of permissions. Can they edit? Can they view reports? Can they activate it? Can they copy it? Most people go with full permissions, but you can restrict that if you want to allow someone just to view it but not to edit it, or to view it and edit it but not to be able to activate it or distribute it. So lots of different options, and you can just type in an email in here and then add that user, and then you will allow them these different features. Again, you can remove users at the end of surveys or at various different points. So you might want someone to look at it at the beginning but not then have access once the data starts coming in. So it's worth just being aware of the collaboration, and that can also be done from your main surveys page. The other tools that are worth thinking about are you can, if you want to, export it to a Word document or export it to a particular survey Qualtrics file that you could send to someone else if they wanted to copy that survey. Maybe worth thinking about that, or you can print it if you want to do a hard copy version. You can look at the version history, so any edits that have been made, you can revert to previous versions if you want to. If someone's made some edits that you were not, you wanted to revert to an earlier version, you can do that. Under review, you can do a spell check, and what we'll show later on is quite useful to generate test responses. So then you can begin looking at data, and we'll look at that when we think about looking at the data later on. The last thing that is worth noting when we're thinking about this general setup of the survey is to preview the survey. If you click on this, it shows you in a new tab what the survey will look like as it stands, and you can run through the survey. It's worth doing this at various different points so you can see how your survey is looking, both on a mobile and on a standard web browser. So that's the key elements of the survey. We'll, in some more videos, we'll talk about how we set up questions and moving through and setting up the survey in more detail.